what I'll try to do is two things. I'm going to maybe go over some of the kind of points I tried to make in the piece. For people who haven't seen it, it's called Notes on Organization, and it's on the website Notes from Below, of which I'm a co-editor. I'm on the editorial board. And the idea in the piece really was to try to make sense of what I think is a sort of fundamental contradiction that the socialist left has to deal with for the moment, which is that on the one hand, and for some time now, there's been a whole number of political developments, movements, struggles, moments of crises that I think we could maybe fairly uncontroversially see as positive for the left, the sort of movements that a socialist project, socialist organization should relate to, recruit in, and build from. However, I think we also have to deal with another reality, which is that that is not the case. In fact, I think that despite momentary moments of what could be seen as possible successes, the different sections of the socialist left, I think, understood very broadly, going all the way from kind of the social democratic left to different revolutionary traditions, has not done well for quite a long time now. And I think that despite the fact that overall socialists have recognized the period of neoliberalism as one of fundamental defeat, I think we have tended to underestimate, on the one hand, really the scale of that defeat, despite sort of rhetorically recognizing it, and to think through what the kind of organizational consequences of that are. And so I'll just run through some of that and then maybe end with a couple of points or ideas towards what I think perhaps socialists should be doing in this period. The kind of main criticism I've received since the publication of the piece that I didn't do enough of that. So I'll try to do some of that while recognizing that these things unfortunately don't come out of the heads of well-intentioned socialists and will have to play themselves out in practice. But hopefully this can be a useful basis for discussion. So, like I said, I think the contradiction of the situation is one of repeated moments of crisis and struggle, potential openings for a socialist left to respond to, a real crisis of legitimacy of the ruling class, and the inability of socialists to respond to it in an effective way. I think the last 6 months, if anything else, captured this pretty well. COVID, the literal sort of collective death knell that capitalism is for the vast majority of us, the breakdown of the world economy, the beginning of what will undoubtedly at this point be the most serious capitalist crisis, certainly in recent history, if not to date. The very stark identification of the power of workers in general and particular sections of the working class in particular, so important that capital is prepared to continue to force people to work, spreading disease and further impactories in Leicester, for example, as a good example of that, or of course the kind of industrial centers in the north of Italy that quickly became the center of the kind of COVID crisis. The so-called key workers, right, that are a pretty visible identification, I think, of the centrality of entire sections of workers for society to function. One could imagine that is a pretty good situation for socialists to make a case both for the extremely dangerous nature of capitalism, the need to move beyond it, and the centrality of the working class in sustaining and creating wealth and all things around us. Yet I think very little of that has happened. At the same time, we have the development of what in discussions with Neil, we sort of agreed where a really international wave of revolt against both racism, state repression, around the kind of Black Lives Matter movement that has internationalized extremely quickly and highlighted, I think, the ways in which repression, racism, and police violence are sort of central pillars of international capitalism and the way the system works. And again, I think we are confronted with the fact that large moments of rebellion and explosion are not capitalized on by socialists, certainly not in the ways that they should be or could be. This is also not a short-term period. I think over the last, let's say, 20 years, I think we could probably stretch it further. There have been a couple of moments of possibilities that the left has responded to. I think in the UK, we can think of the Stop the War movement, the Scottish independence referendum, and maybe to some extent the student revolt of 2010, where the socialist left has had some influence, but again, not enough. And I think fundamentally, the inability or the difficulty of socialists to make their case are linked to two interrelated questions. On the one hand, a fundamental weakness of the labor movement, which, like I said, I think although we recognize it, we underestimate it. I think we underestimate the almost non-existent levels of organization in the private sector and the extreme weakness of labor organization in the public sector, and an imbalance in the organized labor movement between a large bureaucracy and a very weak rank and file, which I think is an ongoing problem. Now, why the labor movement particularly, I don't know if that's an argument I need to rehearse here in detail, but it's perhaps worth pointing out that if we are to take seriously the fact that socialism is to be the emancipation, the self-emancipation of the working class, its activity and its participation are, of course, central, but also because it can, of course, institutionalize and sustain struggles, I think, much longer and in a much more serious way than the disparate kind of social movements that we're repeatedly seeing can. And I think this is sort of repeatedly the problem we come up to, not only in the UK, but internationally, which is the inability to mobilize both the organizational power of the labor movement and also its economic power, its ability to shut down capital accumulation and hit the ruling class where it hurts. And this is not only true, of course, in the UK, but more broadly. And so that the weakness of the labor movement, and maybe that's something we can discuss more in detail later on, but that its organizational, that its weakness has both organizational and political consequences that I think both weaken social movements in general. So I think people involved in social movements should have an interest in strengthening labor, and also make it much harder for socialists to make a claim of the specific agency of the working class and the labor movement in bringing down capitalism, which then raises a question of organization more broadly. And that's really the kind of the heart or the key claim that I made in the piece, which is that I think one of our real problems as socialists is that the organizational methods we rely on are fundamentally based on social relations that no longer represent reality. What do I mean by that? Is that I think if we take the main traditions of the socialist left, both social democratic and revolutionary, they are based on a number of economic and political realities which are no longer the realities we deal with today. So, the kind of, what is a good way of saying it, the sort of romantic harking back of the left of the Labour Party, captured perhaps ironically best by Ken Loach's movie, The Spirit of 45. I say ironically because I think Ken Loach probably has more radical politics than that, but this idea that what we could do is that if we wanted to, we could just return to greater redistribution through sort of a social democratic program that the Corbyn movement really represented in an extremely mild way. And of course, that was based on a very specific historic situation. The kind of golden years of social democracy are the golden years of capitalism, right? They emerge out of the aftermath of the Second World War and the dual reality of a militant working class that is highly organized and highly politically confident, and an expanding capitalism that is prepared to negotiate with this militant working class to exchange greater redistribution of wealth in exchange for a level of industrial peace. Neither of these things are a reality today. There is not a militant or well-organized working class, and capital is neither willing, because of its long-term kind of crisis in profitability, nor forced to negotiate for greater redistribution of wealth in any way. And I think it's one of the problems we continuously see is that social democrats attempting to move to power, like in the UK, for example, or taking power, like in Greece, are confronted with the reality that that kind of that double reality that generated the possibility for social democratic reform in the beginning of the second half of the 20th century are simply not there anymore. So what of its sort of revolutionary alternatives? Well, again, I think the problem is that the vanguardist type model, certainly in the Trotskyist left, and I think in Britain it's less important, but in Europe, the kind of Maoist variants had similar approaches, was the idea that under conditions of struggle, the existing mass organizations of the working class, the Labour Party, the trade unions, the communist parties, would run into the contradictions of their own politics, and that there would be mass breaks of these organizations to the left, of which the Trotskyist left would be able to capitalize by having the sort of the right program and having developed the right kind of political leadership. A political gamble, I think, or political analysis that can be defended, again, in a period of mass working class organization, certainly in the case of very small, comparable to the kind of mass organizations of the labor movement, small organizations, you can understand that political strategy. I think, again, we have to deal with two things. One, that political strategy failed everywhere. There is no example of that being effective. And two, those mass organizations don't exist. I mean, we can maybe claim now that with 500,000 members in the Labour Party, we could develop that strategy again. But I don't think so. I think we have to deal with the historical evidence that at the high point of struggle in the 60s and the 70s, even in moments of potential revolutionary tension, there are no examples of mass splits to the left of the kind of mass organizations of the working class. And so that I think both of the organizational models, beyond the arguments of revolution and revolt, which I think are in revolution and reform, sorry, which so don't want to say reform that I make it revolution and revolt, but revolution and reform, which of course are important, and I don't think we should push them aside, but that even on an organizational basis, the fundamental assumptions that were made by the different sections of the socialist movement simply do not apply, I don't think, to our reality today. So what does that mean? In the piece, I kind of discuss the fact that I think perhaps a better historical comparison is the late 19th century. Not that I think it's the same as today. That's never true. And the late 19th century is a very long time ago. But I think for a whole number of reasons, it's a useful kind of historical period to look at. I'm not going to rehearse that argument here. I'm happy for us to discuss it if that's of interest to people in the discussion, but I'd rather use my last 10 minutes to think about where next. What does it then mean to think of this sort of triple situation? One of repeated crisis and resistance, one of a fundamental weakness of the socialist left and an inability to respond effectively to these moments of crisis and resistance, and what I think is a inappropriate organizational traditions that would allow us to deal with that. And I want to propose a couple of possible ways forward that hopefully will be useful for us to discuss. I think there are two main aspects to it, underlined or build upon one fundamental strategic focus. I think the fundamental strategic focus is and has to be the rebuilding of socialist organization, but more fundamentally, the rebuilding of working class power, which I mean both politically and organizationally. I think if we are to be serious about building a socialist program, we have to be, or socialist project, we have to be serious about rebuilding working class political leadership and working class self-organization. I think that has to be the sort of underlying question that we confront in all the kind of different initiatives that we take. I think the two maybe more practical ways out of which we can start that process is, on the one hand, I think we have to build or move towards organizational unity. However, not an organizational unity, and I think there's been some points of tension or disagreement on this kind of over email in discussion with Neil, so I look forward on maybe having that in greater detail here. I don't really see that emerging out of the existing socialist left. I think when I talk about organizational unity, I'm thinking about the people and networks that have identified points of struggle where it is possible to organize and to rebuild working class organization. I think that's exists in trade unions, people who are trying to run either sort of organization campaigns in unorganized workforces, as well as people who are trying to develop rank and file power within existing kind of trade union formations. And I think, I'm sure we can collectively think of a whole number of people and groups who are doing that kind of work. I've been accused of overemphasizing the workplace. And although I think I do overemphasize the workplace, I remain one of those socialists that thinks that that's where our focus should be. I don't think it's the only place where our focus should be. So for example, I think, and I'll come back to this, that the question of housing is absolutely crucial and is about to become much more crucial in the months to come. The aftermath of COVID and the reopening of eviction courts will see, by all accounts, a dramatic increase in evictions and homelessness in the UK. We've run a piece on Notes from Below, if I can have a second plug, and I promise it's the last one, written by Callum Cant on exactly this question, on the question of the coming unemployment and housing crisis that we'll deal with. So again, I think, you know, organizations like Acorn and the different sort of housing networks that exist will be absolutely crucial in developing this sort of organizational unity I'm talking about. I think the existing networks that organize migrants, both against the sort of deportation and border regime, as well as in the workplace. I work in higher education myself, and the kind of campaigns of migrant workers in universities have been some of the most radical and most inspiring. Cleaners, security guards, catering workers, etc. And of course, we can think about that in different places. Again, I think the COVID crisis has identified what some of those places could and should be. You know, the fact that the Johnson government is flying in hundreds of Eastern European workers in the middle of their anti-migrant rhetoric to continue the food production in Britain should probably tell us something of what one of the critical nodes of organization and workers' power could look like in Britain today. So I think the question of migrant worker organizing, and of course there's others, but you know, so this is what I mean, is I think those are the kind of places where we should seriously start moving towards organizational unity and bringing people together to responding to some of the kind of current moments and questions of crisis that we are dealing with. I think on the other hand, we should strive for political debate and divergence, in a sense. I think there is a huge need for different groups of socialists to develop political centers in the way Hal Draper talks about, the need to develop analyses of capitalism and class composition today as it exists, and to have real debate and discussion about how we understand the social relations in which we are operating today. I think there's actually very little of that in a serious sense on the Marxist left. I think on the one hand, there's a rehashing of the solutions that were already found in the 70s, and as we can all see, worked really well. So why on earth should we rethink them? And on the other hand, a sort of much more limited discussion in a more journalistic sort of sense of the next crisis and next problem. But I think there's very little sort of structural analysis of what do we think the main avenues of capital accumulation are, the central elements of the working class, and the key points of where resistance should be or could be focused. And again, I think I've said several times that I think COVID has sort of clarified that in a whole number of ways. So that while we should move towards organizational unity, if I may borrow from the Maoist tradition I mentioned earlier, I think we should let 1,000 flowers bloom in the ideological and kind of theoretical field. I think we need more debate, more disagreement, more engagement, and more analysis, and that the idea that we would be able to form a unified sort of analysis of where we are right now doesn't seem realistic to me, because I think we just haven't done the serious work necessary to do that, certainly not outside of kind of sort of very general kind of more academic discussions, but actually in terms of doing so with a strategic view to organizing and transforming the situation. I think we've done very little of that. So what does that then mean very practically? Well, I think there are a couple of tasks that are necessary for socialists. First of all, I think there is an immediate crisis we will need to deal with, and that's the crisis I've already alluded to that COVID is creating. In the months to come, there will be a triple crisis of housing, unemployment. I think it's 2/3 of employers have said that they will not rehire workers that they've furloughed, and less than 1/3 have said that they definitely will. So we could have more than 2/3 of employers sacking furloughed workers. In higher education, again, which I know sort of intimately, thousands of workers are being sacked in the months to come, with casual workers not being rehired, contracts ended, etc. Yeah, that's going to be replayed in a whole number of industries. That growth of unemployment will be linked also to an increase of exploitation in the workplace. The workers who remain in the workplace will have to deal, because of the growth of unemployment, with an employer's offensive. And so I think it's important for us to start talking now and to start thinking about how this practical unity I talked about can start coalescing around the question of responding to what will be, I think, by all accounts, a massive employer's offensive, with a sort of, well, we paid all this money during the crisis, somebody's going to have to pay for it. And so I don't share the optimism of some comrades who seem to think that austerity is finished. I think it will take a different form. There will be some investment, but I think we will see an austerity on steroids in the months to come. Finally, and then I promise I'll shut up, I think there's a number of things that small groups of socialists can do in terms of developing a socialist current in the middle of responding to this workers' offensive, by trying to coalesce forces that clearly are well beyond the kind of socialist or Marxist left. Like I said, I think we desperately need serious analyses of contemporary capitalism and class composition, and we need to put forward our understanding and our analysis of what we think the key strategies of accumulation of capitalism in the UK are on the one hand, and where our key possibilities of resistance are on the other. Secondly, I think we need to do a much better job of amplifying existing experiences and examples of serious attempts at reorganizing in the labor movement. I think there's a whole host of serious labor militants who have organized in workplaces that we do very little with. For example, I think we should be shouting on the top of, on all the rooftops about workers who have gone into the unorganized workplaces and have organized them, mainly in the private sector, and also people who are trying to do that and think through what works, what doesn't, etc. This is some of the things that Notes from Below is doing and wants to continue to do. I lied. I said it was my last plug, and I just did another one. I think we should take socialist education more seriously. I think there is a real lack of that. A real lack of taking seriously the fact that there should be reading groups, debating groups, discussions, etc. In my piece, I talk about an experience in Manchester that is bringing together trade unionists, people from different socialist traditions, people inside of the Labour Party and out, and they're reading Marxist classics and debating what's relevant, what isn't, what does this mean for politics, etc. And I think we should see groups like that in any city where we're able to start pulling them together. I think we talk too little about our ideas and our tradition, and we should do it more. And so, yes, I think I'll leave it to that. But so I think those are the three areas I would think about, yeah, I think there are two organizational focuses and one strategic one that I think we should focus on. The strategic one is that I think underlying everything we do, we need to be thinking about rebuilding working class self-organization on the one hand and working class leaders on the other. And I think practically the two ways in which we should be doing that is to strive towards organizational unity to respond to what will be a massive employees offensive in the months to come, years to come. And on the other hand, rebuilding socialist education, socialist politics, and increasing a culture of analysis and debate, which I think, unfortunately, we lack terribly for the moment. And so, of course, I welcome the opportunity of starting doing that right now with you all.